I'm Margaret Lundvall, and president of the Women's Club. I'm so excited to welcome you to this live streamed event. I think we can all be proud that although the clubhouse had to close its doors due to the COVID-19 crisis, the Women's Club is continuing its mission of providing lifelong learning to our members. This program was originally planned for January 20th of this year at the Women's Club, and it was rescheduled due to the gun rights rally that was held at Capitol Square that day. Our staff is making all of this possible through Zoom, and you'll be able to watch this program and share it on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel, and we'll send you those links soon. During this presentation, we hope that you will submit your questions on the Facebook Live post, and we will pass them along to the speaker, and he will take your questions after his talk. Now I want to introduce Courtney Hires, our chair of the day, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Margaret, and good afternoon. It is a pleasure to introduce Kyle Kondik, who will be speaking to us today by live streaming. Kyle is the managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball at the University of Virginia Center for Politics. The Crystal Ball is an authoritative, nonpartisan newsletter on American campaigns and elections. He is a frequently cited expert on American politics who has appeared on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, PBS NewsHour, and Comedy Central's The Daily Show. His book on Ohio's presidential voting history, The Bellwether, was released in June of 2016. He also serves as the center's communications director and is based in Washington, where he manages the center's DC office. Welcome, Kyle, to the Women's Club.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks to Courtney and Margaret, and also the rest of the team at the Women's Club. Obviously, we wanted to do this back in January, and we've had other sorts of hurdles come up to do this presentation, but I'm really glad I'm getting an opportunity to do it via this live stream. And I've got to say that if I had given this presentation back in January, I think I would have had to have done to it what Speaker Pelosi did to President Trump's State of the Union address, which is to just rip it all up because it's basically obsolete at this point, what I would have told you back in January. And that's true on one hand, and that obviously the world has changed. And I think what the focus of the election is going to be, the coronavirus crisis is something that we weren't really thinking about all that much 3 months ago. You know, that said, there are a lot of things that really haven't changed, which is sort of part of the challenge for myself as an election forecaster and for people following the election, in that there seem to be all these huge events that happen during this presidency, and yet public opinion doesn't necessarily change all that much. First of all, I just want to kind of look at the president and some of the assets that he had in his bid for a second term, and to just sort of check in on what those assets were and are, and sort of how they're holding up now. So I think first, there were sort of three big factors I think you could point to. And I mean, there are other things, but these are the ones that I was really fixated on, that are all sort of arguments in favor of an incumbent president winning a second term. Number one is strong perceptions of the economy. Two is the lack of an unpopular foreign war or foreign policy crisis. And the third one is strong support within the president's own party. So let's look at how these things have changed. So for most of this president's term, perceptions of the economy really were good. Factors like unemployment were very low. Quarterly gross domestic product growth was really pretty decent. More broadly, things like consumer confidence were pretty good, and these are just surveys of how people feel about the economy. And also the president's approval rating specifically on the economy also was really consistently quite good and consistently positive. Now, obviously, we're in the midst of basically an economic calamity. I hate to say, but I think it is true. And actually, people's perceptions of the president's handling the economy actually still are holding up within polls. But I do think that this quarterly growth number in gross domestic product is really one to watch. And specifically for elections, growth in the second quarter of the election year can often be predictive. And so if it's a positive number, that's generally a good sign for the president. And it has been positive for over the course of this presidency. And that was a factor that I think was arguing in favor of Trump being reelected. And yet, we have to consider the strong possibility, in fact, that we're going to be seeing essentially a record low number in terms of quarterly GDP growth. So just to put the numbers in perspective, if you look at it over the course of 2018 or 2019, you'd be seeing, plus 2, plus 3%, that sort of thing. And the worst quarter ever for GDP growth in the post-World War II era was the first quarter of 1958. And that was minus 10%. And so you've had other quarters that have rivaled that. One of the quarters during Jimmy Carter's reelection bid in 1980 was also weak. Third quarter in 2008, in the midst of that economic crisis, also was very weak and a negative number. But again, the lowest was minus 10%. And if you look at some of the projections, J.P. Morgan recently projected that second quarter GDP growth could be as bad as minus 40%, which would be 4 times worse than any quarter we've had in the post-World War II era. Those quarters are 3-month stretches, and we're just at the start of the second quarter here in 2020. And so we're not going to get that number until July, after the quarter ends in June. But it seems like a decent guess that this is going to be the worst quarter of GDP growth in the nation's history basically since the Great Depression. And also unemployment could reach something like 20%, which also is kind of a Great Depression style kind of number. The highest unemployment rate in the post-World War II era is about 11% in 1982. And so we're in an economic calamity. Now, of course, we don't know how voters will perceive this, and that it may be that the president, who generally gets maybe more credit than he deserves, and that's not to deal specifically with this president, but all presidents, maybe more credit than they deserve in good times and maybe more blame than they deserve in bad times. But the unusual circumstances of this crisis, in that the economy is shut down not necessarily because of intrinsic problems in the economy, but rather because of this forced shutdown of basically people going outside of their homes, or being very limited going outside of their homes, is really the culprit. And so again, that may provide the president with something of a benefit of the doubt. But if you were just sort of generically, if you had told me a couple of years ago and not told me the reason that we're going to have such horrible economic growth in the first half of 2020, I would say that the president would be a very significant underdog for re-election. Now let's look at the 2 other factors I mentioned. The second one was that the president has not really gotten the country involved in a major foreign war, and sometimes bad public perceptions of overseas conflicts can lead to a president or a party having trouble. And you think about Lyndon Johnson's decision not to run in 1968 in light of the Vietnam debacle, both the 2006 and 2008 elections, when the weight of the Iraq War and the economy, but a lot of it was the Iraq War, particularly in 2006, weighed down the Republicans and ultimately contributed to Barack Obama winning the White House in 2008. And the Korean War also helped to end Harry Truman's presidency. We're not involved in a major overseas conflict. Obviously, there are American troops deployed overseas, but we're not in the mix of in Iraq, of Vietnam, or Korea. That is something that I think is still an asset for the president, particularly because he did campaign as someone who was kind of specifically going to try to roll back the very aggressive foreign policy of the George W. Bush Republican Party. But I will say also that to the extent that foreign policy is going to matter in this election, it's probably going to have to do with what the candidates are saying about China's culpability for the spread of coronavirus all over the world. You may have seen in the Washington Post, there was a big story yesterday about how both the Trump and Biden campaigns are starting to run advertising, basically accusing the other of being soft on China or not foreseeing the crisis. And so, again, to the extent that foreign policy matters in the election, it may also effectively be tied to perceptions of China and coronavirus. But the third asset for the president is still in effect as well, and that is that the president has very strong support within his own party. Historically, if you look at presidents who decided not to run for another term in the post-war era or who ended up losing in the general election, one of the early warning signs for presidents has been a strong primary challenge, or at least some primary opposition. If you think about Gerald Ford, when he lost to Jimmy Carter in 1976, Ford was challenged pretty strongly by Ronald Reagan in the Republican primaries that year. Ford ended up winning, but of course losing in November. 4 years later, Jimmy Carter was challenged by Ted Kennedy in a very aggressive Democratic primary. Carter beat Kennedy, but then ended up losing to Reagan, who had won the Republican nomination in 1980. And then also 1992, where George H.W. Bush won renomination pretty easily by the Republicans, but he did have a challenge from Pat Buchanan, who in some ways was kind of a Trumpish style figure in the Republican Party, but before Trump was a member of the Republican Party. Buchanan won about 40% of the vote in the first in the nation New Hampshire primary that year, which I think we can interpret in hindsight as being a real warning sign for Bush. And of course, he ended up losing to Bill Clinton in the general election. You also had significant defections from the Republican Party, going to Ross Perot, who ran as third party candidate that year. And I think some of the Buchanan voters may have defected to Perot, and Perot also won a significant share of Democratic voters. If you look at the primary results on the Republican side this year, Trump doesn't look like those weak incumbents. He looks like strong incumbents like Ronald Reagan in 1984, Bill Clinton in 1996, George W. Bush in 2004, and Barack Obama in 2012, in that all of them essentially coasted through their primaries, had no real opposition. Trump was routinely getting 90-95% of the vote in the Republican primary season, even as Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, and others were fighting for the Democratic nomination. Also, the president's approval rating with self-identified Republicans continues to be very strong. It's usually in the 80s or even 90s in national opinion polling. And that to me suggests that the president probably has a relatively high floor, even if people's perceptions of him and the economy end up being bad. There's just a large chunk of Republican voters who are going to stay loyal to their party regardless. And so probably a significant or the lion's share of the president's base is basically immovable. And he did win the election with only 46% of the national popular vote in 2016. His approval rating right now is usually about 45% or so in national polls, about 50% disapprove. Those are not particularly good numbers, but they're also not horrible numbers. If you look at where Jimmy Carter was in 1980, he was sometimes in the 30s. By the end of his term, George W. Bush was also even in the 30s and even in the high 20s. That has not happened for Trump. Now, it's very hard for him to get to 50% plus approval. We basically have not seen it throughout his presidency. Also, it's been interesting in that, yes, the president's approval went up a little bit in response to the crisis, and there's some belief that this is kind of a rally around the flag effect. But the president went up maybe 2-3 points and has sort of fallen back off. He got to as high as maybe 47% approve, 49% disapprove. But again, it's sort of fallen back to that kind of 45 approve, 50 disapprove split. If you look at some leaders in other countries, they have gotten double-digit bounces in approval polls, and also here in the States, some polling indicates that some of the state governors in which we have polls available, like Andrew Cuomo of New York, Mike DeWine of Ohio, Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, Larry Hogan of Maryland, a lot of these governors have seen their approval ratings skyrocket and go up 10, 20 points in response to how they've handled the crisis. And granted, I think governors are sort of inherently kind of less partisan sorts of figures than a president is, but I think it also helps show how a lot of people's perceptions of this president are sort of locked in concrete. Biden, of course, was able to win the Democratic nomination effectively in essentially over the course of kind of a crucial 10 days or so, in which Bernie Sanders did pretty well in the first 3 contests. Biden revived his campaign with very strong African-American support in South Carolina, which is a very diverse state. That also helped force Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar out of the race. Biden did better than expected on Super Tuesday. And by the time you got to the March 10th and March 17th contests before the race sort of took a pause, it was very clear that Biden had turned the tables on Sanders. If I had been speaking to you all in, say, mid-February, I might have said that Sanders was actually pretty well positioned and Biden had done so poorly in the first few contests that he seemed like he was sort of running on fumes. But ultimately, Sanders could never convince a majority of the Democratic Party that he was the right person to run. And there was a majority of the party who wanted someone else, and they eventually settled on Biden. And I certainly would say that's true for both regular voters and also for leaders in the party. And one of Biden's strong points in particular is that he's done well in affluent, highly educated suburban areas. And I think Virginia is a great example of that, in that he really romped over Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and Michael Bloomberg, who were in the race at the time in Virginia. You look at places like Northern Virginia and also in the greater Richmond area, Hampton Roads. Biden did well all over the state, but he really did well in some of those suburban places. So that's sort of the heart, I think, of Biden's support. And also a lot of those places have been driving some states, including most notably Virginia, more from being sort of a purple swing state to being more of a Democratic state. And I think we've seen that reflected not just in the 2016 presidential results, but also in the state results from 2017, 2018, and 2019, where Democrats held all the statewide elected offices, won control of the state House and the state Senate, and also flipped a number of congressional seats. Overall, Biden is leading by about half a dozen points nationally over Trump. However, the race is generally closer in the swing states that are really going to matter in this election, and that has remained true even as we've gone through this crisis here. And that's why I still think, despite some of the bleak numbers for the country, and that maybe the president would get blamed for, I don't think you could look at the numbers right now and say, oh, well, Trump is a huge underdog to get reelected. I mean, I still think that it's a close competitive race. If Trump were to lose, it wouldn't be hard to figure out why, in that he ultimately would be blamed for a poor response to coronavirus and also for the economic problems that we're going to have, at least here in the short term. But we just don't know how people are going to react to that. I think people like me will sometimes make assumptions about how the public's going to react to this or that, and then sometimes you don't actually see the effect that you might have expected to see. One final note, just addressing Biden as a Democratic nominee. I think particularly as Andrew Cuomo has become much more of a national figure in his own press conferences and remarks about the response to the crisis, there have been some thoughts that, oh, well, Cuomo could replace Biden as the nominee. And ultimately, that would not happen unless Biden basically surrendered the nomination, because Biden is going to get a majority of the pledged delegates by the time the nomination season is over, which it's now bleeding into late June and into July. But it's not like, some people say, oh, well, the party leaders are going to swap out Cuomo for Biden. Party leaders can't do that. Only Biden can do that, because if Biden has a majority of the pledged delegates, which he's going to have, then he's going to be nominated again, unless he decides he wants to drop out, and there's no real reason to think that he would do so. And so, barring some sort of unexpected development that would cause Biden to actually surrender the nomination, he's going to be the nominee. Let's move on to talk about the vice presidential choice, which is something that is going to be an important choice for both Biden and arguably for Trump too, in the coming months here. Biden obviously said very publicly that he was going to select a woman to be his running mate. Unlike if he would have said that maybe 2-3 decades ago, when there weren't as many women in high elected office in the United States, governors, senators, et cetera. There really are a lot of women Democrats that Biden can choose from. So again, he's got a number of different people he can consider, probably a dozen or more. And I could sit here and make guesses about who he might choose, but ultimately, I think I'd just be blowing smoke. I mean, I think that it's ultimately just a decision that's up to Biden. It's up to the person selected to choose it. And so, unless you're a mind reader, you really can't guess with all that much accuracy. For some reason, historically, and I don't exactly know why this is, but Democratic presidential candidates seem to love selecting senators to be the running mate. 15 of the last 18 people who were chosen by a Democratic presidential candidate as running mate have been senators or people whose most recent job was in the U.S. Senate. Of course, Biden himself qualified for that when Barack Obama chose him to be his running mate in 2008. Biden was a very long-serving senator from Delaware. He'd served for more than 35 years in the U.S. Senate. But Republicans are generally more balanced in their choices in that Republicans don't lean on senators as much when they make their selections. Obviously, Mike Pence is an example of that. Pence was the governor of Indiana, and then prior to that, he had served in the U.S. House for about a dozen years. You think about someone like Dick Cheney. Cheney had a very long resume of public service in federal office as a former Secretary of Defense, member of the U.S. House, former White House Chief of Staff. But Cheney had never served in the U.S. Senate before he had been selected. And even think of someone like Jack Kemp, who was a former House member and cabinet official when Bob Dole picked him in the 90s. Whereas you've got, Biden was a former senator. Tim Kaine, of course, is sitting senator when Clinton picked him. John Edwards was a senator in 2004. Joe Lieberman in 2000 when Al Gore selected him. And so naturally, if you're just using history as a guide, you'd probably think that maybe Biden would select a senator. And certainly, there's a long list of qualified, accomplished Democratic women in the Senate from whom he could choose from. And so Kamala Harris from California, Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota, Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts. They all were presidential candidates themselves. Notably, more often than not, the vice presidential choice is not someone who ran for president in that given year. So Biden was an exception in that he was a presidential candidate in 2008, although not a very successful one, as he got lapped by Obama, Clinton, and others in that year. But if you think about Kaine and Pence, the two most recent selections, neither of them were active candidates for the presidency in 2016, and many of the other choices were not as well. So of course, Harris, Klobuchar, and Warren would be candidates who ran for president, failed, but ended up joining the ticket. But then you also have non-presidential candidates who could be chosen. So Tammy Baldwin, senator from Wisconsin, Tammy Duckworth from Illinois, and Catherine Cortez Masto from Nevada. So those are just half a dozen senators whose names have come up a lot, and any one of them could be a plausible selection. One thing to remember, if a senator is chosen and then that person ultimately becomes vice president, is that the Democrats would have to then give up that seat. And particularly if there's a Republican governor, for instance, in a state, it may be that the Democrats would actually lose control of that Senate seat, but by appointment to replace them by the governor, or in a special election. And it could be kind of risky because, as I'll get into, I'm going to talk about the Senate a little bit. The Senate could very well be very closely contested, and if the running mate ends up becoming vice president and could potentially cost the Democrats the Senate, that would be a very costly choice for vice president. So it may be that Biden will consider other people, non-senators, to be the running mate. One person who has really been in the news quite a lot lately is Governor Gretchen Whitmer, of a Democratic governor from Michigan. She, of course, has had these very public battles with the president. And also another governor to watch is Michelle Lujan Grisham of New Mexico. And then there are some wildcard candidates who've been mentioned. Susan Rice, who I believe has never run for elected office, but she is a former national security advisor and also ambassador to the United Nations on the Obama administration. Stacey Abrams, a former state house minority leader from Georgia, who lost a pretty narrow and bitterly contested race for Georgia governor in 2018. And also Keisha Lance Bottoms, who is the mayor of Atlanta. Now, again, usually the people who are selected are the people with pretty high levels of national experience, and so folks who have served for a long time in the House or the Senate, or as a state governor. And also, I think Biden is particularly aware of, the fact that he is an older candidate in his late 70s, and he has talked about how he views his candidacy and potential presidency as acting as what he calls as a bridge to the next generation of Democratic leaders. And so I think, one, he has to be aware that the person he selects could hypothetically be the Democratic nominee as soon as 4 years from now. I mean, Biden is not going to make some sort of pledge in which he says, I'm only going to run for one term. Supposedly the Biden campaign discussed that on account of his age, but other candidates like John McCain in 2008 thought about doing something like that. And the reality is that campaigns find that when they do polling on this question and run focus groups asking voters of their party whether they would want this one-term pledge or not, voters are almost always against it because they feel like they would sort of be electing a lame duck from day one. But ultimately, Biden does have to recognize the reality that he's a bridge to the future of the Democratic Party, and that because of his age, I think his vice presidential choice may be scrutinized more than normal because voters may have to think about the decent possibility that either that person would be the anointed person to run for president in 4 years, not 8, but also that something could happen with Biden's health while he was president, and that person would have to take over. And to me, that's an argument against some of these candidates, VP candidates who have less experience, like Abrams, who really from Georgia, who does not really have any high-level elected experience. Susan Rice doesn't have any elected experience at all. And even Whitmer, while she has an impressive sort of state political background, she's only been governor of Michigan since 2018. And so if Biden really wants to select someone who has more formal experience, that's maybe when you start to look at someone like Klobuchar, who's been in the Senate for 3 terms, Elizabeth Warren, who has only been in the Senate for about 8 years, but has been a national figure for a longer time, and some of the other senators. And so that may, again, I think the best bet probably is that Biden would select a senator, and perhaps one of the women that I mentioned, but potentially someone else. But again, it's ultimately up to him, and don't be surprised if it's someone who is kind of a wild card, and that's where Senator Cortez Masto from Nevada seems like someone who's potentially an interesting choice. Now, historically, vice presidents don't really do all that much in terms of attracting voters. For instance, you could probably argue that maybe Virginia would have been a little bit closer had Clinton selected somebody else as her running mate as opposed to Senator Kaine. But I suspect that Clinton still would have won Virginia in 2016. There's some feeling that maybe the vice presidential candidate is worth maybe a point or two in his or her home state in service of the presidential candidate. And so maybe that is actually an argument to select someone like Baldwin from Wisconsin, which is a very important state, as I'll get to, or Governor Whitmer from Michigan, which is another very important state. But again, historically, VP candidates are not chosen to win a specific state or specific reason, but ultimately to be someone who's compatible with the president, someone who doesn't hurt the ticket, and someone who could potentially take over if something bad were to happen to the president. I think for my own feeling on the vice presidential choice is you could sort of look at it as sort of the Hippocratic oath for doctors, and first do no harm. Don't select someone who's going to cause you trouble. And there have been some VP picks in the past who I think have been sort of caused problems for the ticket. I think if you remember Dan Quayle from 1992, he was regarded as something of a weak pick. George McGovern in his disastrous 1972 Democratic nomination, he ended up picking a guy named Thomas Eagleton to be his running mate. It later came out that Eagleton had some mental health problems and had undergone electroshock therapy. That came out in the press, and McGovern, after saying he was going to keep Eagleton, ended up dumping him, and he went with Sergeant Shriver, who was a member of the kind of Kennedy extended family. That, of course, ended up being McGovern lost in a landslide. So, again, I think for Biden, it's find someone who's capable of governing and find someone who's not going to cause the campaign headaches in the fall. Now, there's also been some kind of rumors, nothing really nothing really proven that Donald Trump might consider picking someone other than Mike Pence to be his running mate for his second term. History suggests that that's probably unlikely, in that the last time an elected president dumped his running mate was way back in 1944, when Franklin Roosevelt got rid of Henry Wallace and replaced him with Harry Truman, which ended up being a highly consequential change in that FDR died only a few months into his fourth term, and Truman ended up serving almost 8 years as president himself and won a term in his own right in 1948. The other example is that when Nixon resigned in 1974, Ford, who was the vice president, took over, and he selected Nelson Rockefeller, the former governor of New York, to be his vice president. But then Ford decided to pick a different running mate for the 1976 campaign. He ran with Bob Dole back then in the 76 campaign. But I bring up these historical anecdotes just to say that this is something that has not happened really over the last several decades, in that I think sometimes incumbent presidents think about picking someone else to run with, but they ultimately decide that whatever assets this new person would bring to the ticket does not outweigh the sort of negative publicity and change that switching up the ticket would make. That said, I think that, so just to be clear, I think that Pence is going to be Trump's running mate. I'd be surprised if he wasn't. That said, though, I think there are some interesting factors here that could weigh into the president's decision making. First of all, if in fact the president's numbers start to sag because of the crisis, and again, we haven't really seen that yet, and we can't be sure that that will in fact happen. But if we get into the late spring and the summer and the president's kind of floundering, he may decide that he needs to essentially kind of throw a Hail Mary. And there are not that many things that a president or any candidate can do to sort of change the narrative of the campaign. But one of the things the person can do is to sort of change up the cast a little bit. You sometimes will see campaigns, fire the campaign manager or change the campaign team, et cetera. And maybe Trump would feel like he would have to replace Pence just as a way to sort of revitalize his campaign. Now, we're not at that point yet, but that's just something to watch. I also think, so Trump's administration has really had a high degree of turnover, in that there have been a number of different people who have cycled in and out as chief of staff, secretary of state, secretary of defense, lots of important high profile positions. And so the president is not shy about changing up his team. And I also sometimes think that, the president is someone who was a reality television star, and maybe he would look at the 2020 campaign as needing sort of a new narrative, or even frankly, like a new character to bring into a new season of his show. And maybe he would decide that he would want to replace Pence for that reason. And another reason is that I think Pence, whatever one may think of him, was a good choice for Trump in 2016, in that at the time, the president really needed some credibility with the socially conservative part of the Republican Party, and specifically white evangelical Christians who were pretty conservative on social issues and are very loyal Republican voters. But there was a lot of doubts at that time as to whether Trump actually cared about issues that social conservatives really cared about, like, for instance, the abortion question, and whether he was going to be reliable on appointing conservative justices to the courts if he'd become president. And Pence was known as a strong social conservative in his time in the House, and also as governor of Indiana. And I think that Pence helped Trump get credibility with some of those key voters, and was ultimately a part of his formula for winning in 2016. Now, I can't sit here and tell you that the result would have been different if he had selected someone else, but when an election is as close as it was in 2016, there are all sorts of things that could have gone into the outcome. Now, here's the thing, though, is that I don't think Trump needs validation with conservative Christians anymore, in that Trump has proven himself as an opponent of abortion. He's proven himself as someone who's going to appoint conservative judges to the court. He has good relationships with a lot of evangelical Christian leaders across the country. And so therefore, Pence might effectively be obsolete, and maybe Trump would feel like he could add someone to the ticket who maybe brings in a new, different kind of voter. The person whose name that comes up a lot in these rumors is Nikki Haley, the former governor of South Carolina, and also was ambassador to the United Nations for a time earlier in the Trump administration. There could also be other folks who would come along. So if Trump were to get rid of Pence, there are reasons why he might do that. I just don't really see it happening. And Trump publicly has made it pretty clear that he doesn't want to dump Pence. So that's sort of the state of play there. In that, we know that Biden is going to select a woman to be his running mate. We don't, it's a long list of possibilities. And the best bet right now is that Trump Pence will be the Republican ticket that gets nominated in late August in Charlotte, or maybe virtually, depending on how the conventions actually happen in the midst of this pandemic. The Democrats already pushed back their convention in Milwaukee from July to August, and Joe Biden has suggested that maybe the convention will have to be held virtually. I now want to bring up a few slides to show you the sort of the electoral state of play in the Electoral College, and I think those are coming up right now. Yes, thank you. So the first map I wanted to show is just that despite the fact that we're in an era of very competitive presidential elections, and arguably it's the most competitive, sort of consistently competitive era in American history. The late 1800s are sort of the only time that rivals it, in that there weren't really electoral blowouts in the late 1800s. And the last 5 presidential elections have all been reasonably close. Obama in 2008 won by about 7 points, so that wasn't too close. But we haven't had a double-digit victor in the popular vote since Ronald Reagan in 1984. But despite the fact that the overall national elections are very competitive, many of the individual states actually are not. In that, if you look at this map, so all the states in red have voted Republican in each of the last 5 presidential elections. All the blue states have voted Democratic in each of the last 5, and then the states in yellow are the ones that have voted at least once for both parties in this 5 election time frame. And it's only 164 electoral votes out of the 538 total. So that's only about 30% of the electoral votes that are sort of up for grabs in any given year. And actually, this map may even overstate the competitiveness of the overall map, in that some of the states in yellow here don't seem like they're going to be strongly contested battlegrounds in the presidential election. So like Virginia, for instance, most people feel like Trump's probably going to lose Virginia, and potentially by more than the 5 points he lost it in 2016. Also, a state like Indiana voted for Barack Obama in something of a fluke in 2008. No one expects the Democrats to really compete for Indiana this time. Colorado, New Mexico also are states that are sort of moving more toward the Democrats. And so if we look at the next slide, which is our Electoral College ratings, so you can see them here. And so this is what we do with crystal balls. We do these ratings of competitiveness for the various states. And you could see that there aren't a lot of states that we view as toss-ups. Those are the ones in yellow. We only have 4 states: Arizona, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, as true toss-ups. We see one side or the other at least favored by a little bit in all the other states. That includes Michigan, which Trump barely won in 2016, and also Florida, that's routinely competitive. We have that as slightly leaning toward the Republicans. As of right now, I guess you could say we have Biden nominally ahead in our Electoral College ratings. We have the Democrats with 248 electoral votes, at least leaning to them. We have the Republicans at 233, and then 57 electoral votes worth toss-ups. One just small little note on this map is that there are 2 states, Maine and Nebraska, that award their electoral votes both statewide and also at the congressional district level. And so, for instance, in 2016, Hillary Clinton won Maine and the 1st congressional district there, but Trump carried the 2nd congressional district in the state, so he got an electoral vote out of that state. So if you see on that map on the side, if you're wondering what those boxes of Maine, Nebraska district electoral votes are, those are the specific electoral votes for those congressional districts in Nebraska and Maine. And actually, there are some scenarios in which those single electoral votes from those congressional districts could actually be could actually be important. I really think that the election is going to be largely decided in 6 states: Arizona, North Carolina, Florida in the Sun Belt, and then Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin in the industrial Midwest. And if you go back to 2016, the reason that Trump won was that he carried Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania by about just about 80,000 votes out of millions cast in those states. Those states were all decided by less than a percentage point. And I think that those are probably the states that are most crucial for the Democrats to try to win back. We are a little skeptical of the Democrats in Florida in that even though the state is often very close, it often seems to kind of break in the Republicans' favor. Even in 2018, which was a really good year for Democrats nationally, the Republicans carried very narrowly both the governor's race and the Senate race in that state, which I think showed the kind of inherent Republican strength in Florida. And then there's also a possibility that you'll see other states that are more competitive. Iowa and Ohio are traditional battlegrounds that swung pretty heavily to Trump in 2016, but were very open to voting for Democrats prior to 2016. And Democrats have shown kind of limited signs of life in those states since the 2016 election. Texas is a big, usually Republican state that has been getting more competitive over time. I still think Trump should be okay there, but that's one to watch. Georgia is sort of in a similar boat. And then it's also possible that Trump could win a state he lost in 2016. If you look at like Minnesota, for instance, another Midwestern state, Clinton only won it by about 1.5 points in 2016. That's another competitive state. New Hampshire was decided by only a few thousand votes in 2016. That's another one to watch. And Nevada is perpetually competitive. So again, there are a number of competitive states, but a lot of them are pretty easy to pencil in for the Democrats or the Republicans. The Democrats are going to do fine in California, Illinois, New York, much of the rest of the West Coast, much of the Northeast. Meanwhile, the Republicans have very solid control over a lot of the kind of Mountain West and Heartland, Great Plains states, also most of the South. So again, if you were to look at elections in say 1960 or 1976, you'd see close national elections like we have now, but also elections where big states like California, New York, and Texas are very competitive. That's not really the case now. In that a lot of the big states are pretty safely in one political column or the other. Let me close by talking about the Senate and the House. So let's take a look at the Senate seats. So the Senate is 53-47 Republican right now. The Republicans actually netted a few seats in 2018, in part because they had such a good map, and also because the Democrats were defending so many of these seats being contested. There were 34 seats, or 35 seats, on the map in 2018. The Democrats had to defend 26 of them, and so when on a Senate map, when you have to defend many more seats than your rival, it's just easier to lose ground. And so in some ways, this map is kind of the opposite of 2018 in that it's the Republicans who are defending significantly more seats than the Democrats are. There are 35 seats being contested this year, and the Republicans are defending 23 of them. And you can see those on our map here. Now, if you'll notice, a lot of the Republican seats are in states that are also pretty strongly Republican at the presidential level, and presidential voting is usually pretty predictive of Senate voting. So the Democrats don't really have much of a chance in a lot of these Republican states like Nebraska, South Dakota, Wyoming, West Virginia, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, even South Carolina, Idaho, et cetera. So again, the Republicans are going to have an easy time defending a lot of these seats. However, I think the Senate overall is basically close to kind of a 50-50 fight as the Democrats try to take the majority. And let's look at the actual ratings for these Senate seats on the next slide. So here are our ratings, and one asset that the Republicans also have on this map is that the seat that's likeliest to flip on either side is Alabama, which you may remember from a December 2017 special election. The Democrat Doug Jones actually won the Senate seat there that then Attorney General Jeff Sessions used to have. He defeated Roy Moore, which if you know anything about that campaign, Moore was a horrible candidate who had a horrible, lurid past. Jones still ended up winning by less than 2 points over Roy Moore. And Jones is a very significant underdog to win a full term because he's back on the ballot in 2020. So when you say the Democrats have to win at least 3 seats to turn a 53-47 deficit into a 50-50 tie, which the vice president would break, whichever, if the Democrats win the White House, that person will be a Democrat, likewise with the Republicans. But that said, you kind of have to account for the fact that the Democrats are probably going to lose that Alabama seat, in which case the Democrats probably have to win at least 4 Senate seats that are currently held by Republicans. They do have some good targets. What you can see on our map is that those diagonal striped lines indicate states where we feel like the incumbent party who holds that seat is actually an underdog to win it in November. So you've got Alabama there as the Democrats' underdog. That's what those red stripes there mean. And then we have Democrats favored to flip Colorado and Arizona, which are 2 pretty competitive races, but we think the Democrats have an edge in those states. And then North Carolina and Maine are 2 other states that are currently held by Republicans, but where we feel like Democrats have basically a 50-50 chance to win. Democrats also are hoping to target Iowa and Montana, special election in Georgia. There's another election. There are 2 Senate elections in Georgia, actually. So there are targets for the Democrats to win the Senate back. But I think the presidential race may end up determining some of this in that, if Joe Biden were to win a significant victory for president, that might be enough to elect the Democratic Senate. Whereas if Trump gets reelected, you probably would think that the Senate would stay Republican. And just locally in Virginia, Mark Warner is on the ballot this year. We have Virginia safe Democratic. Warner does not really have strong opposition, and despite a close call in 2014, I think he's in pretty decent shape. So the final slide I want to show is just talk briefly about the U.S. House. And so in the House, the Democrats, of course, won the majority in 2018. The Republicans would need to win about 20 currently Democratic-held seats to win control of the House majority. And one thing the Republicans have going for them is that there are 30 Democrats who hold districts that Donald Trump carried in the 2016 election. And basically what we've seen, as I mentioned earlier, is that presidential voting kind of helps inform down ballot voting to a significant degree. And so if Trump were to carry a bunch of those districts again, and if there wasn't that much crossover voting, if people were just voting straight tickets for both president and for House, you could imagine how the Republicans could win the House back. That said, even reelected presidents often don't provide much help down the ballot for members of their party in the House, in that you've had a number of recent reelected presidents who won their elections but generally did better than their House candidates did, or their party's House candidates did, and you didn't see control of the House change when they got reelected. And I think that may be a good template for Trump, even if he wins in 2020. And we have in our own ratings, so 218, of course, is what you need for majority. We have the Democrats at least slightly favored in 226 seats. We have the Republicans in 193, and then we have 15 toss-ups. And so that toss-up column is going to have to get a lot bigger for the Republicans to really have a shot at winning the House. 2 seats to watch in Virginia. One of them is in the greater Richmond area. So Virginia's 7th congressional district, which covers some of the western Richmond suburbs, and then also cuts up into more rural parts of Virginia. Abigail Spanberger is running there. We'll have to wait and see who the Republican candidate's going to be. And then also Elaine Luria running in Hampton Roads. Jennifer Wexton won in Northern Virginia in 2018. Her district has become very Democratic over time, and so it doesn't seem like she's going to be in any trouble. But Spanberger is one of the big races in the House, and frankly, I think that if you see Spanberger's race getting very competitive, that may be a good sign for Republicans overall, whereas if she kind of skates easily to victory, that may be a sign that the Republicans aren't making that many inroads into into the House. So right there in the Richmond area, you have one of the probably 24 or so most highly watched House races in the country. And I would say that Elaine Luria's race in Virginia 2 in Hampton Roads is also one to watch. So with that, I just want to show you my last slide, which is just some information about our Crystal Ball newsletter. If you're interested in this sort of thing and American politics and elections, you can get our newsletter for free. It's just at centerforpolitics.org/crystal ball. You also could just Google crystal ball, and the first couple things that'll come up would be eBay ads for actual crystal balls. That's not us. But if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see Sabato's crystal ball. And I'm also very active on Twitter at K Kondik. And with that, I think we've got a little bit of time left here. And so I think that Courtney had just a few submitted questions that I would be happy to answer with the remaining time.
There we are. Thank you so much, Kyle, for that fascinating overview of national politics and where we are at this point. I do have a question that came in on Facebook, and this viewer writes, in terms of the three factors affecting an incumbent, I am surprised that you didn't mention Mr. Trump's attacks on our long-term allies and his undermining of the US's trustworthiness as an ally. She writes, to me, his combative approach to foreign policy has been one of the most troubling aspects of his presidency. How do you think this factor influences public opinion at this point?
That's a good question, and I think there's a lot to unpack with it. So the president, even when he was campaigning in 2016, I think kind of ran as a critic of the United States' role in the world, in that he was very much, it shows in his slogan of America First, which is, kind of, I don't know if this was cognizant on his part, but it was a throwback to kind of pre-World War II isolationism and a real skepticism of this idea of America being brought into foreign entanglements. And the president also was a strong critic of international trade agreements, specifically NAFTA, but also ones that emerged in more recent times, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership that ultimately the Obama administration wanted to do but got scuttled. And in some ways, on foreign policy, both in matters of war and peace and also on trade, the president kind of sounded like a Democrat. At least, or rather, at least sounded like kind of a Rust Belt Democrat. I'm from Ohio, and Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio is someone who's very liberal, but also some of the things that he believes about trade are not that different from things that Trump believes about trade. And I think there's a lot of folks who have kind of recoiled. I would think the person who asked the question is one of them, at the president's kind of disdain for international institutions and for working closely with allies. But I think that to some voters, that was a significant part of his pitch, in that they believe in a reduced footprint for the United States in the world. They think that, particularly in some places that maybe are outside of big metro areas and suburban areas where the president really did quite well, they think that they have been on sort of the losing end of internationalism. And look, I think there's also some xenophobia that goes into that too. In that, I think that the president has been, critical of immigration writ large, and that was part of the pitch for, building a wall on the southern border with Mexico and that sort of thing. But there is, whatever one may think about that sort of rhetoric, I think there is an audience for it. And also the Democrats find themselves in a tricky position on, let's say, particularly trade issues, because, Joe Biden is someone who has been supportive of trade agreements in the past, but also he wants to pitch himself as someone who is a better fit for kind of blue collar Rust Belt America than Hillary Clinton was. But it may be that on issues of trade and how people feel about the local economy, that some of those folks who may have voted for Democrats in the past may have even voted for the Obama-Biden ticket feel like the Democrats are sort of the more internationalist party, and that's maybe not where they necessarily want to go. So again, I do think that Biden will specifically attack Trump, in the debates, assuming they have debates, over erosion of international institutions. Democrats in general are a little bit more supportive of institutions like the United Nations, et cetera, than Republicans are. But the president will have comebacks on that, and they're comebacks that might ultimately be appealing to at least some segment of the population.
All right, thank you, Lyle. Another question from a viewer. If Joe Biden picks a socialist-leaning vice president, will that cause him to lose centrist votes, in your opinion?
That's a good question, too. I think that, there are different choices will appeal to the different demographics. And that, let's say he selects Amy Klobuchar, for instance, from Minnesota, who, a white woman from a swing state. Klobuchar may be reassuring to suburban voters, but if Biden is trying to attract some of the Sanders voters who maybe would be tempted to vote Green Party or not to vote at all, maybe Klobuchar is too centrist. On the other hand, if Biden were to select, like, say, Elizabeth Warren, for instance, Warren is she doesn't use the socialist label for herself the way that Bernie Sanders does, but Warren, I think, is certainly someone who ran as on sort of the more left-leaning edge of the Democratic Party in the 2020 presidential race. Could Warren, maybe scare off, maybe attract some of the Sanders voters, but maybe scare off some of the kind of suburban moderates who I think are really crucial to Biden's election. And in fact, again, I mentioned this in the presentation, but if you look at Northern Virginia or Greater Richmond or places like suburban Detroit, for instance, you really see Biden do quite well and generate a lot of turnout in the primary there. But those are voters who may not, may prefer someone like Klobuchar to someone like Warren. The point I'm making is that there's not going to be any perfect choice, and whatever assets a candidate might bring for one demographic, that person might also repel voters from a different demographic. I will also say, though, that I think for the most part, voters are deciding based on the top of the ticket. And also in an election like this, Trump is a more important figure than Biden, in that Trump is already president, and this is kind of a referendum on Trump to some degree. I think in 2016, one of the things that tripped up analysts, and I would include myself in this, is this idea that even that Obama was in the White House, and so the election kind of ended up being a referendum on the Democrats and Clinton, as opposed to being a referendum on the challenger in Trump. Trump doesn't necessarily have that asset now of being an outsider.
Kyle, a question has come up in the last couple of months. We've heard from some prominent voices, such as Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina, that Black voters may support Trump in greater numbers than he received in 2016. Now, a big part of that support, which was the booming economy, of course, has now disappeared, at least for a while. What do you think about that? Do you think that support he may have been building with Black voters will hold?
So of course, African-American voters are, the strongest Democratic Party constituency in the country, and that Democratic presidential candidates can routinely expect 90% plus support from African-American voters. That said, it's not like Trump's going to win the Black vote, but if Trump could get 15% instead of 10%, that's really significant, not only in states with significant African-American voting populations, places like Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, but also you got to remember that there are significant African-American voting blocks in a lot of the crucial states of the Midwest too. If you look at Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and Cleveland and Detroit and Milwaukee, a lot of African-American voters in those places. And there are some subtle signs from polling that show that Trump is doing slightly better with African-Americans than he did in 2016. And again, we're only talking about the difference between 8 or 10 points versus 12 or 13 points. And one of the things that Trump has really highlighted, besides the economy, which you've mentioned and which may or may not be an operative argument anymore, but it has been some of the criminal justice reforms that the president has supported that attempt to address the high imprisonment rates in America, and that specifically seems to apply to African Americans, and that's something that he's going to pitch. I think also the president was successful in 2016 at painting Clinton as someone who was very supportive of mass incarceration in the 1990s. He could probably do the same thing to Biden. So that's something to watch in the Trump campaign messaging. And again, it's not Trump's not going to win the black vote. He's not going to get a third of the black vote, but the difference between, again, high single digits and low double digits could really be important.
Kyle, one last question before we have to sign off.
Sure.
Will voting by mail have an impact in November?
Great question. And if anyone is curious about this, I just moderated a panel at Center for Politics on Thursday, a virtual panel like this one, talking about all the ramifications of voting in the midst of this pandemic, which I didn't really get into in this presentation. But if you're curious, that's linked on centerforpolitics.org. And you could check that out. But despite what some partisans say, it doesn't seem like voting by mail really benefits one side or the other. We did just have an election in Wisconsin, decided last week, in which Democrats were furious that the election took place and there was much more absentee balloting. And then it turned out in the race that people were following, the Wisconsin Supreme Court race, the Democrats did great in that election. And so it didn't end up being that much of a hindrance. Certainly, I think states that have kind of liberalized their voting rules in recent years are probably going to be better equipped to deal with this. Virginia is one state that has done that, and that Virginia was not a state that had a lot of absentee voting, but now it does because of some of the reforms that the new state legislature made that the governor signed recently. And look, I think it's incumbent upon states to make sure that people can vote as easily as is lawful. But that is something to watch, because also we were kind of operating under the assumption that turnout was going to be really high this year, because turnout in the midterm is really high and interest in politics seems very high, and those are sometimes predictive of turnout. But of course, we don't know how hard it is going to be it is going to be to vote coming up in November, and there are certainly going to be way more voters who want to take advantage of early and absentee voting, and some states have a good infrastructure for that and some states don't.
Kyle, again, thank you so much
Thank you.
for a fascinating presentation about our national and our local politics as well in Virginia.
Thank you.